You said you'd moved a bunch of times around there. One of the comments that you'd made that really stuck out with me as something that, I mean, in a lot of ways, the book mirrors things that are going on today, but something that might happen for other kids today is that you had a fear of cops. Like there was a cop that came to your school to talk to you about the DARE program, and you were concerned that they were coming for you. What was it like for you to sort of interact in those double worlds like that?
When the DARE program started, that was like fourth grade. I was 9. I was pretty used to the double life. Police always scared me, still make me nervous, even though, here I am, a white lady in my 40s. I've got all the privilege in the world. But there's this ingrained reaction, of growing up knowing that the police could send my parents to prison at any moment, right? Yeah. And I want to be clear. I understood always as a kid that we were outlaws, but I was taught to see it as being good outlaws. There was this idea in my family that the laws themselves were corrupt, which looking back, they were. Right. But I was taught that growing up. And so it actually, in an odd way, gave me a very strong moral compass. This idea that society can tell you that something is wrong or that something is right, but really you have to look at it and decide for yourself where the truth is, and that the intentions of the authorities might not always be honorable. And that, it's also just a civil disobedience ethos that if the powers that be are in the wrong, it's your duty as a human, as a thinking human, to break the law. Yeah. So I grew up with that. Just from my earliest memories, I had the sense that, this idea that the cops were the bad guys and we were the good guys. And so I knew to lie to protect my parents. They had to make it clear to me because I couldn't go to preschool or kindergarten and talk about what was going on at home.
But you don't remember them really telling you.
No, and neither do they. We've tried and tried and tried because people always ask us. But I think it was so basic. It was a core value. But we were kind of like a Robin Hood family. It always felt like the work was good.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about how your mom took that ethos into helping when the AIDS epidemic started, because you guys were still living out of the city and she would make drives in with you. And every time you guys drove in, you wrote that you'd see the changes in the people that you'd gotten to know in the Mission, the Castro district, which is where a lot of your mom's friends and people that you'd grown up with. What was that period like for you?
In the early days when we were just coming down once a month, I was aware of it on more of a subconscious level. I was like 5, 6, 7 years old. And so at that age, kids are very adaptable, and I would absorb the changes without really looking at it and going like, why is this happening? Yeah. Once I was able to begin to understand it, my mom was not into secrecy at all. So, I'm sure she explained AIDS to me as much as was known about it. It's also looking back, I think it's hard for people to connect the fact that just how little understood HIV AIDS was and for how long. So it began to emerge in 1981 were the first little news articles about it. But there was not a lot of understanding, and it was such a strange disease because it weakens your immune system. And so the symptoms could be really varied. And there wasn't an HIV test until 1985. And there wasn't any FDA-approved treatment until 1987. That was AZT, which didn't work very well. And there wasn't an effective treatment until 1996. That's 15 years. Wow. And during that time, people were just dropping dead. The government turned a blind eye. Reagan didn't even say the word AIDS. He didn't say the word until 1985, didn't give a dedicated speech about it until 1987. 6 years, and by that point, 20,000 Americans had died. Yeah. So it was a really strange time where the populace, which initially was mostly folks in the LGBTQ community, although that broadened over time, but people were really left to their own devices, which is just so horrible. It was such a horrible, horrible, painful, disfiguring, tragic disease attacking these young, beautiful people. And there was nothing. Medicine had nothing for them. So cannabis emerged really early on. People noticed that it helped with appetite. I mean, the munchies, everybody knows about the munchies, and that it was helpful with nausea. Some people had already been taking it for chemotherapy-related nausea. So there was a beginning of a medical marijuana movement prior to it, though it was small. And it was really HIV/AIDS that kicked the medical marijuana movement into gear, that made it a national topic of conversation.
Right.
And eventually that changed the laws that we are benefiting from today in the cannabis community.
And that kind of, the epicenter of that sort of started with San Francisco, the gay neighborhoods. And
very much so.
The fact that they were turning to these brownies,
right,
that they weren't able to smoke because you can't really get away with smoking as easily as you can as just eating, right?
The preference for edibles, I think, was more connected with the pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. That was one of the main killers in HIV/AIDS, is this terrible pneumonia. And so obviously smoking is not going to be good for that. Edibles were gentler in that way. So it really was a good home remedy for people. Obviously, it wasn't going to cure AIDS. Nobody thought it would, I don't think. But it helped with some of the deadliest symptoms. The number one killers were the wasting syndrome and pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. And it helped. And it helped with depression and insomnia and pain. And it really brought a sense of relief to the people who needed it. And so my mom slipped into that very early and in a very natural way, because her particular client base had always been in the Castro. And so these were her friends and customers for years, and all of a sudden they're sick. And so that transition, I don't think it was even a conscious decision. I'm going to become part of the medical marijuana movement. For her, it was just a very smooth, very natural transition. But it also, over time, it changed her. And it changed her reason for showing up. It changed her reason for breaking the law. Whereas before, she enjoyed being rebellious and believed in the herb herself. She got a kick out of it, and it was a way to support her family. But when that came along, she had really a sense of a higher purpose behind it and a willingness to take those risks. Now, the really key figures in medical marijuana, of course, were Dennis Perone and Brownie Mary. And these were people who, they got busted over and over again. And every time there was a bust, they would go to the press and they would take the fight to the press. More than anyone, Dennis is responsible for the actual changing of the laws. But these were colleagues of my mom. So she never got busted. She never went to the press. And so nobody knows she exists.
Right. And so she used to get kind of confused for Brownie Mary, like maybe they're the same person. We never see them together. But she's just the Brownie Mary that got away with it, really.
Exactly.
And that's why this story is kind of so incredible, because you really get to tell what she went through to get to this point, and then the political situation around it as well. But it was heartbreaking too. It really brought to light the struggle that a lot of people went through in the 70s to get to this point, to the point where we see it as medicine. So that's really down to your mom. That must be a crazy feeling.
It was interesting because going into writing this, I didn't realize really how important her role had been. And so I did start out just writing a family story about this creative community that I'd grown up in. And, I knew it was a cool story, but I wasn't connecting the dots myself. And it was only through years and years of research that it dawned on me that this movement really had grown out of this community. And not just today's access to cannabis, but really a life-giving force in people's lives. And so it became, for a writer, it was a gift in that it gave me a real drive to write the book. One of the main reasons that I came back to it, because I put this down for years after it didn't sell. And one of the main reasons that I came back to it was that in the lead up to the 2016 election, which is when in California, Proposition 64 legalized adult recreational use.
Right.
So in the lead up to that, it became obvious that it was probably going to pass in California. And I noticed how little was being said about HIV/AIDS, that there was a kind of erasure going on. And it was unconscionable to me because this was a community that was actively being erased while the HIV/AIDS epidemic was happening. Yeah. That the politicians wouldn't talk about, that people outside of the LGBT community were happy to not look at and not consider. And because of that, many more people died. I mean, obviously, right? Yeah. By the time Prop 215, which Dennis Brown co-wrote, passed, the Compassionate Use Act, the first medical marijuana legislation in the country. By the time that passed in 1996, 380,000 people had died of HIV/AIDS.
Wow.
And it's unconscionable. The government had done nothing.
Yeah. And these are the kinds of things that I think people my age may not know. I was born in 86 and we're all coming up now and we're able to enter the cannabis industry, but we don't really know what it took to get there.
Right.
It was just when we were babies that these kinds of things were kicking off. But like I learned about Harvey Milk through your writing and how long the political buildup had been to for the gay community, the gay rights community, and for the cannabis community, and the fact that they intertwined kind of during that AIDS epidemic, it almost strengthened both platforms, I felt.
Absolutely. And for a long time, throughout the 80s and 90s, most medical marijuana activists were AIDS activists also. Mm. That connection, it is so strong. And for it to be left out of the conversation and for there to be generations of cannabis people and today's cannabis activists to not know that, to not understand that. Like there's a debt of remembrance. That's one thing. Okay. I feel personally a responsibility to the people who died. That's one thing. But also, if you don't understand the history of the movement you're involved in, you're missing important tools. And so, for the cannabis community to move forward, there needs to be an awareness of how that road was paved. Also, how much this relates to the importance that communities of color have preferential access to cannabis licenses, things like that, because these are the communities that were most significantly harmed during the war on drugs. Things like that. I mean, you have to have an awareness of where the legislation that you're fighting to change comes from, the bigotry around it, the homophobia and the racism, in order to work against it. I learned so much writing this book. I mean, I didn't know all of that going into it. I just grew up in it. You're a kid and this is your world. Yeah. But to come at it as an adult and as a researcher and investigate this long and circuitous path that led to the access we have now was really interesting. And I got to present to my mom the idea that she was a trailblazer, and she wasn't thinking about it. It's like you make your decisions on a daily basis. She did what felt right for her friends and her community and her family. But she wasn't looking at the broader picture either. It takes a step back to get there.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. I hope that you found great clarity in writing this story for you and, new connection with your father, it sounded like. I won't go too much into it. I want people to enjoy the book, but it was just a very in-depth look at the gay community and the underground cannabis community in the 70s and just the historical context around it and how we got to now. And I think it was a holistically great book. I loved it.
Thank you.
I really did. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I've learned so much more just talking to you. And I think this is fascinating. And I really can't wait to see it on the big screen because I could visualize the whole thing. And it looks gorgeous.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure.
And now for your latest cannabis news. The Library of Congress has been working on a new project called Chronicling America, and they're using it to bring light to the outwardly racist words that used to surround cannabis in the media. Last week, the library published a timeline from 1897 to 1915 that included newspaper headlines talking about dangerous Mexican weed. And the Library of Congress's project has turned into